Dip, 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 dip. Sha-la-la, sha-la-la, party. Sha-la-la, sha-la-la, party. Sha-la-la, sha-la-la, party. Sha-la-la, sha-la-la, party. Dip, 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 get a job. Sha-la-la.
Here we go for Chapter 18 Overview, Revolutions of Industrialization, 1750 to 1914. Main idea. The Industrial Revolution began in Europe and spread around the world, transforming the social and economic structure of societies that industrialized. Relevance. Think about your life if this had never happened. You wouldn't have this, you wouldn't have this, and, hold on, you wouldn't have this. What would your life be like without factories? The Industrial Revolution represents the second major change in all of world history. The first was 10,000 years ago. The second was about 250 years ago. And the third is happening right now. Setting the stage. A long time ago, you learned about the Agricultural Revolution, which created a way of life that we call subsistence farming, where people lived on small plots of land and basically produced their own food. There were some advancements in agricultural technology, and this was the pattern of organization for human societies for essentially the first 10,000 years of civilization. The scientific revolution in the 1500s created faith in the ability of the human mind to solve any problem, and faith in continuous progress. Here's Isaac Newton with the apple about to fall on his head. These two ideas from the scientific revolution would combine to create the second biggest change in world history, the Industrial Revolution. Explaining the Industrial Revolution. From its beginnings in Britain in 1750, the Industrial Revolution spread to Europe and eventually around the world, changing the production of goods from hand to machine-made, transforming societies in the process. Why Europe? There's been lots of periods of technological advancement throughout history. In the Islamic empires in China between 700 and 1200, for instance. So why did this start in Europe? There's really three main reasons your textbook goes over. The first has to do with competition among European states. You can see the green represents major industrial areas, and it's spread across from Great Britain into Northern Europe. This was a result of the growth of nationalism, causing these states to compete with each other for power, and after Britain industrialized first, industrialization meant money, and money means power. The second reason has to do with the need for these new states for tax revenue, and they're encouraging growth and innovation in merchant classes, unlike in other places like China, which resisted the influence of merchants. Here's a painting of Dutch merchants. In the Netherlands, which you know had a lot of presence in Asia and a lot of power, the merchants essentially ran the country. And the third reason it happened in Europe first was access to natural resources, especially in the American colonies. This engraving shows the mines of silver in Potosi. So it started in Europe, and more specifically, it started on one tiny island in Britain. Why did it start in Britain? Well, there's two reasons that we can focus on. The first is a culture of tolerance of business and an approach to science that emphasized practical experimentation leading to inventions. This is a group of people who were members of the British Royal Society, and the British pursuits of science emphasize practical experimentation as opposed to theoretical ideas, which is why a lot of the first industrial inventions were created by British people. The second example for why Britain industrialized first was the presence of a lot of basic resources like coal and iron, which provided fuel for the factories. This model here is a steam engine, which relies on coal to produce power, and Britain was blessed with an abundance of that natural resource. So, the book starts off by talking about the social effects of industrialization by focusing on Britain. The Industrial Revolution transformed British society, leading to new philosophies of social organization in response. And there's really three societies, social groups that the book focuses on. The first is the British Aristocracy. When I found this picture online, it was described as a modest British country house. There is still an incredibly wealthy group of people that are landowning aristocrats. However, during this time, they declined in influence and were surpassed by businessmen who were involved in this process of industrializing and owning factories and producing goods. And this was a time of business for the British Empire, and businessmen bought homes like these to demonstrate their newfound influence. The second group is the middle class. This group benefited the most from industrialization. It grew both in wealth and in influence. This group was organized around the principle of self-improvement and discipline, and hard work and finding your own way in life. The role of women in the home were a part of this respectable lifestyle in Britain. And the third and largest group, about 70%, were the laboring classes. Living and working conditions in the cities were terrible, and that led to a variety of social protests and solutions. This painting, called Coalbrookdale by Night, demonstrates how the Industrial Revolution transformed the landscape of Britain. The next section in your book talks about social protest, and there were three main responses to problems caused by the Industrial Revolution. The book will explain some of those problems to you. The working conditions were horrible, the living conditions were horrible, it was dangerous, the pay was low, there was a lot of disease. It was a difficult time for the lower classes. And the three main responses were these. First, trade unions. This is an effort to organize workers to improve conditions, often by striking, and this is an engraving of a strike in Britain. The second was created by a man named Robert Owen, and that is socialism. He advocated smaller industrial communities and that the owners would treat the workers well. And the third, and probably most important, certainly in the 20th century, is the philosophies of Karl Marx. And he took socialism and extended it, and we refer to that as Marxism or Marxist socialism. Marx called for a complete transformation of society, with workers uniting to overthrow owners and redistribute the wealth. This was the most drastic solution to the problems of the 19th century that would completely transform the 20th century. More about that later. The book goes on to talk about industrialization in the United States and Russia. Industrialization spread around the world, including to the United States and Russia, where it affected society in substantially different ways. First, with the United States. Industrialization without socialism. The Industrial Revolution spread across the U.S. This map shows industrial centers. The red dots are places that had major manufacturing, and the green and the blue and the purple are resource-based locations, coal, iron, and silver. So the United States also was blessed with a lot of natural resources. There was substantial industrial growth and wealth created in the U.S. There definitely was some labor unrest, and labor unions were formed to fight for improved conditions for workers. Here's an example of a strike. Yet a single party did not arise to support the rights of workers. This was largely due to ethnic diversity of workers and a relatively higher standard of living for workers in the U.S., which prevented them from either being able to or desirous of uniting to fight back against owners. And this is a contrast to Russia, where socialism dominated the response to the similar problems that they faced. Russia's efforts to modernize in the 19th century included freeing the serfs and beginning a program of industrial development. The autocratic nature of the Russian state led to socialist responses as the only way to protect the people from the effects of sweeping changes. Two revolutions challenged the absolute power of the Tsar. In 1905, the Tsar, that's an absolute monarch in Russia, was forced to make some concessions, but he didn't really follow through with those, and everything kind of fell apart, which led to the Communist Revolution in 1917. This was led by Vladimir Lenin, who was shown here in the picture on the right, and that would transform the 20th century, and that is going to be discussed in a future chapter. The big difference then between the US and Russia being, in Russia, there was a unified response of the working class to the problems of industrialization, and that completely transformed the country. The book goes on to talk about the effects of the Industrial Revolution on Latin America. The Industrial Revolution caused Latin American countries to increasingly participate in global trade markets with a variety of effects. After independence in Latin America, here's our map showing when the countries in Latin America became independent. After the revolutions of the early 19th century, Spanish America split up into several countries, and the book explains that class differences persisted as countries attempted to create autonomous independent rule. And many of those had to do with their participation in the world economy after industrialization. These Latin American countries became an important part of the world economy as a source for raw materials. This map, which is in your textbook, shows the huge variety of raw materials that were present in Latin America. And basically, this led to the development of what we call an export economy, which meant the economic system of Latin America was dependent on producing and harvesting these raw materials like oil or rubber or coffee and sending them to industrialized nations to be converted into finished goods. These nations invested heavily in Latin America to make this possible, and that's primarily the United States and Europe. So the last sections is about the effects of this change on Latin America. Latin America developed many of the same issues in this economy as industrializing nations did, but did not experience a widespread industrial revolution. Lower classes often protested economic and social conditions, but only in Mexico did this result in a revolution. That's pictured here on the left, which changed the political structure of that nation. Also pay attention in this section to the growing power of foreign companies in Latin America, such as a U.S.-owned company called the United Fruit Company. Now our 10-second spice review. Industrialization created new problems for the lower classes, causing some governments to institute limited reforms. Industrialization was fueled by natural resources, especially fossil fuels, which provided a source of energy for new industrial technology. The growing influence of the United States and Europe led to charges of economic imperialism in places like Latin America. And finally, a visual summary. The Industrial Revolution begins and spreads, and this is in order from left to right, first to Britain, then to Europe, then the United States and Japan. These created social challenges, which led to three main responses: unions, socialism, and Marxism. And all of that resulted in major changes in the global economy, with some nations industrializing, some nations participating in an export economy, and some nations, as of the 19th century, not having participated in this process at all. That's our overview for Chapter 18. Happy reading!